Hello, my name is David Bryan, and this is Curiosity Invited, a podcast inspired by endless curiosity. Tune in for an open-minded conversation about interesting and important things. Hello, and welcome to Curiosity Invited. My name is David Bryan, and today I have the great pleasure of speaking with Jane Edberg. Jane is a writer, professor, and artist who's helped inspire, challenge, and support creative people for over 30 years. She holds a master's of fine arts in studio art, photography, and performance art. She's a retired art professor, taught art appreciation, photography, and design at various universities, and spent 20 years full-time at Gavilan College. She currently teaches writing at the Lifelong Learning Institute at California State University in Monterey Bay. Jane's in the process of completing a hybrid memoir of images and prose called The Fine Art of Grieving, about how she used art to process grief and heal from the loss of her son. She plans to publish this book in 2022. She authors a webpage and Instagram and Facebook pages by the same title. And it's my great pleasure to speak with Jane Edberg. I hope you enjoy it. It's really something. It's a very different place. Well, so I'd like to start. So you're an artist among many other things, but an artist and a writer and a thinker, and I know that you've taught art for many years.
Yeah.
But how did it all start? If you could walk me through that, or walk us all through that, like, were you interested in art when you were a little kid? Were you one of those people who was constantly drawing and making things? So tell us that story.
That's a really, I wrote a lot about that, and I think it gets broken down to my grandmother being an influence because she really liked the classics, whether it was music or, some kind of literary thing or art. And she's the one that took me to art museums or introduced me to the idea of various artists, but it was really in a classical European sense. She was.
And how old were you? Were you a little tiny kid?
Yeah, like far back as I can remember, 2 or 3 years old, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what spurred me to be an artist was a situation, is one of many situations, is that my household was a bit turbulent, and I don't need to go into that. It's more kind of a private thing, but in order to deal with that, there's a story that I wrote that's actually in my book that talks about if I was angry but I couldn't resolve my anger, I would hold my breath, turn blue, and pass out. And I remember
this is true.
Yeah. Which was seen as like, she throws fits, she's high strung, all that sort of thing, when really it was just a way of coping and trying to disappear in a situation.
Wow.
And I remember waking up to my mother saying, "Do you think you're the Queen of Sheba?" Like I did that on purpose to get away with something, right? And I wondered about that Queen of Sheba thing. I in my little kid mind, I was 4 or 5 at the time, and we were going somewhere, and I was all dressed up, nice tight ponytail, frilly little dress and stuff, and I went in the backyard, and it had been it was the slush season, it was in Canada, so there was a lot of mud, and I picked up a stick and I whacked the mud really hard because I was really mad, and it went up over her flowers onto the wall, and I was like, wow. I equate it to my first mark making or art making. Yeah. That it was like, there was my anger, but then all of a sudden I felt like, that's beautiful. And I just kept doing it until my mother came out and like smacked the back of my legs, you know. But I thought to
How
myself,
old were you? How old were you?
4 or 5.
4 or 5.
Mhm. And I remember seeing the look on my mother's face, the power in her anger. She smacked me. I was like, you know, but it was worth it. It was
Mm,
like I got to find that power that could, one, change the results of someone else, make someone else feel what I was feeling.
mm.
And it was a very powerful moment for me. And I refer to that as my big me. Like my big me evolved. Like,
You,
I've got a certain sense of power
you
here.
made reference to that. I was going to ask you what that was. So that's the big me. Oh,
That's the
that's a
big
great
me.
story.
Yeah,
That's a
the
great story.
discovery of that self that,
Yeah.
has autonomy and can, really drive something about their emotions or about
And you
how
don't
they.
have to turn blue.
And I didn't have to turn blue. And it's interesting because I'd love to ask my mother, did I turn blue after that? I don't think I did. I think that was kind of a moving forward in my sense of expression.
Well, so okay, so the big me appeared, and then
Oh,
how did
yeah.
it translate into I'm going to be an artist,
Yeah.
and what form did it take, and you obviously went to school for it? Well, you got your
I
master's. I
did.
don't
I
know
did.
what
I
you get.
got, which I actually avoided at first. I thought, I don't want to be an artist. Who wants to be an artist? I thought that meant having to draw things perfectly. I didn't want to do that. What happened, again, I've written about this, and so which means that I've thought a lot about it. When I went to school, I found very little interest in what was being taught to me, and so I would daydream, and I would also, in my classroom books, tear out the blank pages, like a chapter page or the pages. I found out where you could find them, at the back of the
Right.
book, in the
Yeah.
start of the book. And I would draw and do diagrams and then stick them in my desk until my teacher found out. And again, I ended up having to go in the cloakroom and bare my palms and take a leather strap to my hands
Well,
for having this really messy desk and ripping pages out of school books.
where did you go to school?
I went to school in Manitoba, Canada, in
Ah,
Transcona. And in fact, the teacher only spoke French in that particular grade. And it was like,
and was it a religious school? Was it a Catholic school or
no, but
open
there
school?
was a religious component because we sang songs about God and stuff, but it wasn't a religious school. I think that
No.
was just part of what people did.
I
It was,
remember I remember telling my wife, you remember my wife?
I do.
Uh, Truth in advertising. That's how I know Jane. My wife and Jane are friends. But I told her about my experience in public school in the United States, in New York and New Jersey, and having to read from the New Testament and see. I mean, it was just part of school
It
then.
was part of school.
Yeah.
And it was also a British colony at the time. And
Mm,
so we had the Union Jack and we sang God Bless the Queen and
yeah.
all that.
Wow.
My parents are British, so it was just like that, that
Yeah.
was part of that anyway. So
So then you decided to did you go to college for art?
well, at first, yeah, I've always been really interested in science too. I was the kid that was like always tearing insects apart and, looking for rabbits in the backyard. And I was outdoors a lot. I was referred to as the term tomboy, which is like,
Yeah.
it's only because I didn't mind getting dirty and I actually liked playing with the boys because they did things that I seemed more, for
Fun.
me, were more interesting. And my father wanted a boy, so he sort of indoctrinated me into
Mm,
what, quote, boys should be doing, which is really weird and interesting at the same time. But because of that, I developed this, that outdoor thing. I became very curious about nature and the way things operated, and I wanted to go into science. So I had started a degree in pre-med, and this was much, much later because I ended up having children
mm.
and living in poverty. And the long story short, it took me a while to get back to school. I never graduated from high school. I had to sort of start over.
Mhm.
And in fact, I didn't read very well or write very well, so it was really difficult. And now I'm a writer and a reader.
How
Yeah,
about that? Yeah.
yeah.
And then did you like, what was the decision from college? I don't want to beat this to death if you
No,
don't want to
no,
talk about
that's
it, but
okay.
what was the
No.
decision? How'd you get from college to art school? And because art school's very specific, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's what you're doing.
Well, my whole life, I've used art as a means to express myself. And in fact, because of those early on experiences, that became my way to cope. And I went through a lot of, hard, I would equate kind of child abuse kind of situation. And it was alcohol, a lot of alcohol in the family and that sort of thing. That in order to sort of survive that, I needed this other means. Otherwise, I would have just turned into, who knows what. I just would have been troubled. And in fact, I think I was troubled. But I could sustain myself and socialize and be okay by using art as a means of expression, either writing or drawing. Writing, I mean, poetic words. And I used to make maps and diagrams and draw insects, but not to make them look like what they were, more to make them look like an
How you
insect
felt
would
like
become
they
a
were.
vehicle,
Yeah,
like it's,
yes.
yeah. And it would be a sense of expression where the vehicle is in two halves, and I'm crawling out of it or something.
Hmm.
So it was a way for me to express what I was going through. And somehow, however that evolved, that helped me to cope. Yeah. And
And
and so along the way, I used it all the way through my life. Um, and people kept saying, "Oh, you're such a good artist, or you're an interesting artist or a weird artist." I got that a lot. Why don't you go to art school? And I'm like, I really don't want to go to art school because my being in art classes, they make you want to create, like, the turkey needs to look like the turkey and the
hmm,
apple needs to look like the apple. And that was my indoctrination into,
sure.
school art. And I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in something that I learned later was actually probably more art than what that was, more illustration, really.
Well, I've seen some of the things that you do. So at some point you learned, or well, maybe that's not true, but at some point you learned that you could and make something look like what it looks like.
Right.
And was
Yeah.
that something that they taught you, or was
That's a
that just a
great,
natural?
no, that's a great question or thought, because um, so I avoided art, and when I went into an art class, I actually didn't do very well in art classes because I resisted the, like, I don't want to make an apple. I just
Yeah.
don't. It's really
Yeah.
boring. And I'd get in trouble for making things different or not doing the assignment, even if I did something that was, clever or interesting. But what happened was, when I started to go to school, I realized I had three kids and three kids by myself at one point, that I couldn't handle the math and the statistics. And, there was so much academic stuff that I had to do to get to the medical part. And then the medical part was going to be like overwhelming. And I didn't think I could do it with three kids. So I'm like, the only other thing I know how to do is art. And then by then I'd seen what people were doing in graduate school. So I knew I had to go through drawing classes,
Got
and
it.
and I
Right.
and I decided, well, that's what I'm going to do. And somehow or rather, within the process of getting into graduate school, I got like I said, I never graduated from high school, so I wasn't even qualified to apply, but I did. And I got in as their star number one student because I made a portfolio like a few weeks before and just handed it in. And they're like, well, wait a minute, you don't even have the right transcripts. So I don't even know how that process happened. But so then they wrote some letters to deans and so forth, and they got me in, and I had to do all the undergraduate work to make up for it. So I double
Oh, wow.
timed it through school
Wow.
with three kids. Yeah.
And how old were
And
you then? How old were you? You had three kids
20,
already.
27. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah.
And I had like a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 7-year-old.
And the impetus at the time for doing that was I got these 3 kids and I got to figure out a way to support them. And
Yeah.
so,
I
and
thought
so
I
was
could.
the,
It's because I thought I could. I thought I could do it after I went to MFA shows and,
uh-huh.
hung out at the university to look. And I went and met with some professors. Is like, I don't like drawing apples. I'll tell you that right now. And they're like, you don't have to draw apples, So I had this like thing, which a lot of people do. I have to say that many folks think that art is rendering something perfect and then you're the perfect artist, when really art is a sense of expression. And then we know that from like Jackson Pollock and people that do like mad crazy stuff. But he also could draw an apple, but anyway.
Yes, right. Well, that's the piece that is it comes up a lot when I speak to people who identify themselves or are identified as artists. They, maybe it's just the people that I speak to, but there's a certain, it's not that attitude that you just expressed. Look, it's not about drawing something perfectly to
Right.
make it look like. On the other hand, all of them can do it.
Right.
And for those of us who can't do that, who in some situations more than anything else wanted to be able to draw an apple, like, or whatever it was.
Here's the equation: practice.
Yes.
That's it. I taught art for 35 years and I could get everyone to draw an apple that looked like an apple over a period of time and process. They just had to learn how. So it's a learnable skill. What's not learnable is that in innate, something that you might have grabbed onto when you were young that sparked that creative muse inside of you. I think everybody can get it, but if you got it when you were young, I think you're better off.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So you've developed that spatial and line, and I was doing things that all when I sat down to make an apple, I'm like, oh, well, yeah, because I've been making lines. Right. I just have to make a line a particular way and just keep doing it until it's right. Yeah. And so in order to get through graduate school and get through my degree, I had to sometimes draw things the way that they looked. So
and then were you excited about the teaching part? Or did you get excited about the teaching part after
I got excited about the teaching part the same way I got excited about art not being able to draw an apple, that art is something that comes, from playing, with line and shade and color and word and dance and so forth. In that I had a couple of really good teachers and lots of really mediocre teachers, even at the university level. People that were self-absorbed and they'd come in and smoke their cigar and blah, 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 and they'd walk out and they'd just leave you to do whatever, I wanted to share what I knew from day one about always being an artist and opening up that part of human beings, because when I first started teaching, these were undergrads. They had an art requirement, right?
I was going to say,
and they're coming in there going, like dreading the whole process.
I can't draw an apple, just so you know.
Right, and like we will be drawing apples, but we'll also be drawing things that you imagine. We'll be, playing with ideas and collaborating perhaps, and doing, a lot of things that you weren't taught, and to open up that part of that wider, broader spectrum of what it means to be creative. That excited me about teaching because I discovered it. I felt like I could share it.
And do you teach writing that way? I mean, yes. Is that always there? That piece? Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is.
And where do you think that came from?
Let me, that reminded me, because as a writer and having studied writing as well, because I was a writer, I could write and it was like interesting and creative, but it wasn't really publishable necessarily. because I was still kind of fooling around, even though I've written for years, you know. And I wanted to get good at it, so I studied it, right? I looked at grammar, and I looked at editing, and I looked at how to put sentences together, the structure, all that stuff, right? And when it came down to at the end is once I had those things, I almost had to unlearn them. And going through art graduate school was the same way. I learned all this stuff. I had to unlearn it in order to get back to that basic human creative self, which I think can get overshadowed by how we think we're supposed to do things. But everything's that way, right? I mean, you know.
Well, so I'm teasing out of this that you have a belief that everybody is creative.
Yes.
Just by
Oh.
and I share that belief, depending upon what somebody means by creative. But
right.
So everybody's creative, but they don't all express it in art. Or do you use the term art? You know, I mean, I had a relationship with a woman years ago who was an artist and very talented and across various media, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not. But the ongoing joke was, you know, when she was going to be expressing herself artistically, it was on a thing. And it looked good afterwards. Mine was, you know, I'm going to demo this wall and something else is, but I didn't think of it as art, and I don't think anybody else did as well. But was I thinking about it the wrong way? Wrong way.
I think if you're just following some directions on how to put up sheetrock and how many nails get put in 6 inches apart, blah, 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 you know, I've done all that stuff too, framing. And you follow that, then that's an illustration, right? You got a diagram and you make an illustration of the diagram in 3D.
Right.
But if you were to make that wall at some interesting angle and modify the structure of it according to, you know, some knowledge that you have about engineering or something, then you're getting creative about it. You're not just making an illustration. And so, you know, I do think that if I was to break it down and look at you do that task of putting that wall up, I might say, oh, that's a lot different than, say, you know, Mary over here. Right. She does it this way. That was your creative way of interpreting the diagram and putting up the wall, you know.
So let me ask you this: why do you think that's important, or do you? Why is art? Why is art important? Why is that important to you, or is it bigger than important to you? Is it important?
I think it's vastly important. I think without it, there just wouldn't be a world. I don't think we'd be able to resolve problems or communicate or appreciate things. I think everything you can think about, I think, has its connection to the creative human. And that if we all just follow directions, you know, somebody has to write the directions. So I guess what I'm saying is that if we all just did things the way that we think we're supposed to do them, how do we even know that? I mean, I don't see how a human being can exist without creativity. I think that's what makes us unique, because I don't see that so much in other animals, although there are animals that weave things and, you know, they think out problems and how to resolve problems. My dog does it, you know. But the human being, the human brain, it's to me, it's sort of staggering and remarkable that we have someone like Elon Musk that can, you know, trying to make a community on Mars. That's creative. That's some wide open thinking that it's even possible. Is a creative process, you know, and designing the rockets to get there is a creative process. And so if I say art and creativity, art has a few realms. They have like fine art in the museum, that's a framed canvas, or maybe even some oddball stuff, but it could be put on a wall, it can be viewed, it can be, walked into or experienced, blah, blah, dance, performance, theater. And then there's art as a whole, is the umbrella of what I think is life. And I think that a human being is living art, but some of us are aware of it so we can play with it. And some of us are unaware of it and we're enculturated so that we're only kind of behaving in a certain kind of construct of who we think we should be or how we think we should behave. And that's why if you look at some artists, they've gone way over, like, past the cultural boundaries of how they think they should behave. They, men in dresses and making art that could eat amoebas, or, it's like they're doing things that are extraordinarily strange. But if you talk to the artist, there's usually some creative process that brought them there, and there's usually some meaning or some form of expression. I don't know if that all made sense. But...
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a favorite artist or favorite artists?
I do. I think right now I've been just looking at so much writing that it's been coming from writing, like Lydia Yuknovich.
Yes.
Who's a writer, and she wrote The Chronology of Water, and she just opened up the whole construct of how we structure a book. And her book is like water. She literally made it flow and undulate and swell up and shrink down and dry up and get really wet, and so it has shape, it has form, it has line, it has repetition, it has all the design elements, it has expression. So I love her work because she's really been playful with it, and it's great because a major publisher published it, so that allows, it's like, oh, we're going to expand the construct of writing. So I see that as art.
And this writing, so you've been working for a while. So sorry.
It's okay.
You've been working for a while on this book, which does it have a title?
It does. It's The Fine Art of Grieving.
Fine Art of Grieving.
Yeah.
And oh yes, that's right. I read it into your bio introduction, but I forgot. So will you talk about that for a bit?
Sure. So the catalyst was losing a son, and that was 22 years ago. And when that happened, that big me part of me like disappeared. Like death was like way bigger than art for me. But art was my way of coping. So there I was with this incredible loss, and the power of that loss, without any way to express it. Like everything just shut down. What was interesting about that is that that's how I felt at that moment, or that year after I lost my son, is that art was over. Art is nothing. Art could never be as powerful as what I just experienced. So why make it, right? I just got completely, it just disappeared from my being. But there I was left with, how do I cope with this? I was just drowning in it.
In what's the it? You were drowning in the sorrow.
Drowning in grief, drowning in the grief and the loss. And not only does one lose one's loved one, they lose themselves when it's that big of a loss, a child, a partner, someone that's deeply, deeply loved. Even when I think about Kismet, you had a cat that was very dear to you. Some people don't like to equate, they have like art, there's like sort of a hierarchy of grief. I don't think there is. I think
you're not allowed to be sad about that. Yes.
No, right. And I think that what it is, it's the relationship that you have with that particular loved one. That's the loss. And it doesn't matter whether it's an animal or a person or as far as I'm concerned. In any case, what happened was I actually was making art. I didn't know that I was, because
What do you
what
mean?
art looked like to me before the death was, I could have an idea and then I'd make notes and I'd draw up some paintings or drawings, and I'd know the meaning, and I kind of interact and play with that, right? But what was happening was I was making art unconsciously, playing with, and this is going to sound bizarre,
Oh, good.
I started to do things like I'd be crying and I thought, it was just impulsive. I got a little test tube and I put the tears in the test tube and put a little rubber stopper in it and put it in a drawer, you know. And I didn't think of that as art. But later when I looked at it, I'm like, there's forever these little tears of grief in a jar, you know, like that's meaningful. And then about a year out, I had this box of ashes and I decided I was going to open them up, and I opened them up and I started like touching them and smoothing them out. I thought, oh, there's like chunks in there of bone. And I got a sifter and I sifted them. And then I touched the sifted part to kind of pat it down. And I saw my fingerprint in the ash. It was that fine. And then I got out my camera and my equipment and I started photographing, placing my hands into the ash. And then I just placed my face into the ash. And the image is of my face. So I took a photograph of the ash, but it just looked kind of flat, like this imprint of my face, but you couldn't really see it. And then I moved the lamp around and I watched the shadows, and suddenly my face popped up out of the ashes, like it was staring back at me.
So, oh my God, just this description, I was so moved by you saying what you said. It's both eerie,
Yeah.
and so touching.
Oh, really? Oh, wow,
Well,
good.
because that's your son's ashes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's my son's ashes, right, in a bowl. Yeah.
Yeah.
And right at that point where I put my face down and lifted up, and then know that my face was covered in ash, sprinkling all over me, my daughter walked in. She was 16 years old at the time, walked into the house, and I was doing this in the living room. I wasn't expecting her home at that time. And I turned to her like this, and she like dropped her backpack to the floor and kind of walked over and looked down and went, "Do you need help?" At first I thought she meant like psychological help, but she didn't. She was raised in a household with a woman who made art.
Right.
So it wasn't too freaky for her to go, "Oh, wow." You know. And she said, afterward, I said, "I don't know." And then she said, "It looks like you're making art." That's what she said to me. And then all of a sudden, honestly, that big me part like emerged again. It was the same as whacking mud on the wall in my mother's garden.
Yeah.
I just went, "Oh my God." Like,
oh my God.
I didn't even look at it that way. I didn't even expect that. And I go, "You think it is?" You know, like, really? And she goes, "No, it's cool." So she helped me photograph my face with ash all over my face. We just did a whole photo session together. You know.
And do you mark that as the beginning of realizing that you were using art to process? I don't.
Yeah,
Process
because
is the wrong word, but whatever that word is.
right. Yes. And
metabolize grief.
Metabolize grief. That's right. And she also said to me, "You know, all the things you've been doing all along are art." And I'm like what? Again, like I just didn't see it. I was just convinced that I wasn't an artist anymore for like a whole year, but I'd been doing things like that. I just didn't see them as art. And so I think that human beings do that. like, there may be things that you do, David, that you would not think were art, but if I was looking in as an artist, I'm like, oh yeah, no, that's art. And I think that
That's not likely, just so you know.
I know. I don't know. I think even doing a podcast and asking questions is it's an art form.
It's something.
But, it's something. Yeah. But you also don't have to claim it or, give. So after that point, I realized I can do this with intent. The way that I worked my other pieces before he died, I can look at what I'm doing and then start to interact with it. And that's what I did.
So no, wait. So back up for a second.
Oh, yeah.
So your daughter opened your eyes to this thing that you were doing,
Yeah.
and then you decided quite intentionally, this is a process I am going to, or this is something I'm going to
Okay.
use to
I'll
somehow nurture myself,
Yeah.
heal myself through this.
And I didn't think about healing. I thought more about just freaking surviving moment to moment,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
something to like latch onto that would give me something to do.
Well, why are you making that distinction? Can I just take a little side
Yeah.
detour here?
Yeah.
So you just made a distinction between sort of working with grief and healing. Why is that important to you?
I was told that I wouldn't be able to heal from grief in the very beginning. And that first year, you believe you never will. I mean, you think you're never going to get over it, I don't know that you get over it, but I will say, I feel good. I don't have, I have very little pain from my son's death or sorrow. If I think about him, I can make myself go into that grief well, but I don't, I consider myself healed. Like a broken leg, there's going to be a part that's a little tender once in a while, but
somebody will always be able to find that spot eventually. When they do the autopsy, they'll find that broken spot, but
they'll find the broken spot.
You're still healed.
That's right. Right. So, and that's part of my takeaway in the book, is that it can be healed. I just didn't know in the beginning. But I understood my daughter when she said it was art, and then I thought, what are my art materials then? I mean, I had been using my camera still because I wanted to document things that were happening in real time, because I was afraid that I was like taking everything in through a little nanotube, that I couldn't at all decipher anything that was going on at the time. I was so freaked out. So I take pictures, of everything. I take pictures of his things. I take pictures of ashes. I took pictures of places I went, just the railroad tracks where he died, So, but I thought I was just documenting to look at it later so that I can make some sense out of it. But in some of those instances, my art self, without me being a driver, I was like an autopilot, was actually making art. It was like this creative muse was happening inside of me without my intent. So now I could use intent. So I started to think of the ashes as material, his blanket. There was a red blanket that he had that he really liked. That became an art material. Flowers became an art material because flowers started to represent different things because of all the flowers that ended up at the memorial service and at my home. And it just took on all this different meaning. So everything associated with the loss, with memorial, with any of it, and things that he did, I would document. And then I started to have intent and make very specific types of photographs. And here's one where I used his red blanket. This is much later, like 5 years later, when I was beginning to discover that the self that I had lost was not recoverable, that this new self was emerging, and it was born from that grief. It was born out on the railroad tracks when I took a photograph of myself right before a train was coming, and I had to dodge the train so I didn't get hit because my son was killed by a train. So this 5 years later, I'm using his blanket as a pond, which I call his name, Nanda Pond. It also was his nickname before he died, Nanda Pond. And it was a way of bringing myself back to this bringing me into a new self, and emerging almost like a womb. Like I needed a womb, I needed a baptismal of sorts, to like claim I'm a new me, and I've got a big me on board. So, so here is that image. Let's see, can you
Oh,
see
wow.
that?
That's you?
Yes. And my daughter helped me take that photograph too. She was up on a ladder. I mean, the whole thing's hilarious. We dug a hole, we put the blanket in, kind of like the lining of a womb, filled it with water, and I curled up in this sort of, fetal position, which is slightly cliche, but it worked for me. And she photographed it from above, and I wanted it in earth. I started to deal with the elements. And I don't know where that comes from. There's something that I really like about the alchemy of earth, air, water, fire. And I started to go through the use of water, air, fire, earth in the making of the art.
That's powerful.
Thank you.
And this is a weird question, perhaps.
Good.
So you've been working on this book for multiple years, many.
22 years. 22 years.
22 years.
Yeah.
So is the process of grieving over, or is the making of the book continuing the process of metabolizing the grief? And at some point, do you anticipate that it will be, I'm done now with that, or every time you read it, or every time somebody asks you a question about it, will you still be metabolizing?
So I think there's sort of, there was a period where I was just writing down words because I just needed to, I couldn't make visual art. So I thought I'll just write some things down, and I was just kind of journaling, in the very beginning. And then because I've always been a poet, some of those words seemed interesting to me, but I still couldn't manifest poems from it necessarily, I thought. But when I looked back a year later at what I was doing, I'm like, oh no, those words are interesting. They just need to be played with more, like again, with intent, structure it. So the first year was like a jumble of stuff that was coming out without consciousness. And the second year was finding all that stuff and starting to shape it. And so the book originally was images and text that were more poetic, the short poems. And nobody understood what I was doing. When I showed it to writers, they're like, well, that's kind of weird. Why do you need the picture? If the writing's good, you shouldn't need a picture. And then if I took it to photographers, it's like, why do you have writing to go with it? If it's, like the same, nobody could see that combination.
Everybody's in their own silo, it turns out.
I think it was just maybe ahead of my time or something. I'm just going to say that. But, so it just wasn't really being received. Sometimes by some folks, they liked it, and it ended up in some galleries and stuff like that, but it still wasn't doing it. And I ended up taking a writing class with Ellen Bass, who's pretty well known, and she loved it. And she said, just keep going, and she wanted me to try to publish what I already had, but for whatever reason, I was compelled to start writing stories because people kept asking me, we need more information. We don't quite get it. We want more. And that just became a worm in my brain. So I started writing it. And then once you start writing and you're in pretty deep, it's hard. I gave up the book a few times because I remember I took it to a publishing group with agents and all that stuff. And one guy took me aside and he goes, this is just, personal, and you should just put it in your drawer and never give it another thought. And I was sort of crushed
So
because I
I
was
think they
so
probably
naive.
said that to Van Gogh,
Oh God.
just put this
So,
in your closet.
but I wasn't emotionally strong enough. And my ego wasn't strong enough to go, what are you talking about? Someone couldn't do that to me now. I'm pretty convinced that what I've written is pretty good, and that, it needs to be in the right hands. But so it got in the wrong hands at that point. So, and so I'm saying that too, because if anybody's listening to this, anybody tells you you should stop doing what you're doing, don't stop what you're doing because one person says to stop what you're doing. I just lost a lot of time. I think I didn't write for 6 months, and 6 months is a long time.
That's the other piece which you haven't said, but it's probably worth saying, is that I think sometimes, there's the recognition by somebody else that what you're doing is creative or art, but there is a certain sort of courage about putting what you are doing out there as art or as whatever it is that you're like.
Terrifying.
I'm going, and it's terrifying, and it's personal,
Yeah.
and it's tender,
Yeah.
and it's brave.
Yeah.
Right?
And
Because
some people have said,
anybody can say anything, right? Anybody can.
Right. Yeah. I had one person say, oh, it's way too dramatic.
Right.
And then later I'm like, well, I'm dramatic.
Yeah.
I'm really dramatic.
Yeah. It's also one of those things. It's like, geez, I lost my son. Is that dramatic enough for you? What are you talking about?
Yeah, except that the only thing I would steer away from that, because some people treated me that way. Like, I'm afraid to say anything to you because this is about the loss of your son. I'm like, at some point, I'm like, it's actually not about the loss of my son. It's about the rediscovery of self.
Yes.
It's like how a death or a loss can obliterate everything that you knew in your world, and the world's a totally different place. How do you navigate that?
That's great.
Well, I can only say how I navigated it, and that's what I'm hoping I offer, is that there are many ways that one could navigate that. But here's how I did it. And for me, it worked. And it worked because that's what I need as a person,
Okay, I'm going to ask a question that you should slap. I mean, you can reach right through the computer and slap me for it.
All right, I'm ready.
How do you know when it's done? I don't mean the book. I mean the process. You now say it's healed.
Yeah.
Right. You are healed. And I'm not suggesting that you're not, but how did you know?
Here's how that happened. There was this day happened, and I was like, something's up, something's not right. And I looked at the calendar and I realized, oh, okay, so I know this is the anniversary of his death. But then I looked closer, and not only was it the anniversary of his death, it was 19 years after he died, and he had lived for 19 years. So I had known him 19 years alive and 19 years dead. And that's a really odd, I love the word equation, but that's an odd equation. And I sort of decided that that's it. I like that marker. I just decided I was not going to be sad anymore. I don't want to do sad anymore over this. I don't want to have to struggle with trying to make sense of this or having to grieve. I grieved. I done so much grief. I'm like, I'm pretty good,
When you reminisce, or I don't know what to call it, when you think back and you remember your son, is there joy?
Yeah.
Well, that I would want to use that as a marker. It's like, when you can feel joy.
Yes. And that's really what was established, is that, but it was also, I felt like it was okay to feel sad if I wanted to. around his
Sure.
death. Not that
Absolutely.
I couldn't help it, like,
Right. Right.
because
Right.
grief was like, I couldn't like not
Sure.
feel bad, right?
Oh,
And
that's a
so
good distinction.
at 19 years, I could go, I don't want, switch the light off. I don't really want to do that. I actually want to feel good. And so let me think of him. But I'd also, it's not like it happened overnight, really. It sounds like it did. But what happened was, over the process of making art and writing about it and being immersed in it and spending a lot of time thinking about it, I slowly came to, this is what it is now. He's gone. And in this other way, I have a relationship with him that has to do with
Mm.
looking at a picture of Scotland, which he always wanted to go to Scotland, and going, oh, he would love that, without going, oh, he doesn't get to go there. He would love that.
Mm.
And really settling for that. And it's a practice. It's like meditation. It's a practice. So I practiced it. And then by 19 years, I'm like, yep, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, I have a weird question for you.
Yeah.
Unless there's more for you to say about this, but we'll probably still be we're still probably still
No, but
talking
you
about
had
it.
another question about how do you know? So it was around, how do you know that grief, you're done with grief, and in writing the book, and if the book comes up or people ask me
Oh
questions,
yes.
that sort of thing,
Are you
right?
are you still working
Um,
on it? Are you still processing it or no?
right. I bet I am,
Mm.
but I don't know that it's grief. I wish there was another word, because grief is like this one umbrella, and I really equate grief with like, oh God,
Yeah,
like I'm going down.
that's a good word to use. I mean, it's powerful enough. It hasn't lost its oomph. So
Yeah.
yeah, but
But
you're
I
still
don't,
metabolizing your son, but not the grief.
I don't even know if I'm metabolizing him, but sometimes things come up and I go, oh, I hadn't thought of that,
Mm.
you know?
Hmm.
Um, or
Mm.
someone tells me a story that I hadn't heard about him.
Oh well.
But there's more of a curiosity. And because it's new
Hmm.
and I hadn't processed it, I can feel the sadness. I'm like, oh, but it's not like grief. I still
Yeah,
don't, yeah,
yeah,
it doesn't, I don't really go there.
yeah. I
I
get it.
can if I want to. I've chosen to sometimes. That sounds weird, but
Yeah, tell me what do you mean? Is there a
um,
certain is there a
well,
good
yeah.
feeling in it?
I think what on a couple of occasions, um, there's been a poignant moment, like say something with his brother that was monumental, that he would have liked to have shared with Nanda. I might then sit with the not the grief yet, but sit with that and allow myself to feel my other son's grief, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
Hmm.
Have empathy for him, which will tap into what I call the grief well, and I can slide into it knowingly and allow that pain to rise up. And I'm okay with it, but it's not pulling me down. I'm actually allowing myself to go down, and I can come and rise out of it. So I still don't think of it as like the full grief where
Sure.
you don't have a choice. This is like a bathing or basking in, not, there needs to be another word. There,
Yeah.
there has to be another word.
Yeah. Well, so here's the you've you've spent a lot of years metabolizing, processing, working on kneading, as in the dough, right?
Yeah.
Of this experience.
Yeah.
And
Wait, is this the
and
weird question?
it might be. I'm not really sure. It
I
gets
haven't
less
gotten to
weird.
slap you yet.
The more it comes out of my mouth, it seems less and less weird. So,
Okay, oh, good.
but but well, so you know, one one of those one of those questions that human beings seem to struggle with, both both philosophically, theoretically, intellectually, is you've been needing, or at least you've been working around for all these years, So, uh, is there, do you have religious beliefs? Do you believe in a God? Do you believe in an afterlife? Is there some connection between what you've been doing, or can you make a connection between what you've been doing and uh, whatever? I don't, here's where things fall apart, because the words mean so many different things to
Right.
different
Yeah.
people. But consciousness, uh, uh, awareness, sort of the ultimate realities. So one, did you start out with that? And two, has all of this work affected how you see all that?
Wow, that's a really good question. I have my whole life I've been curious about God, you know, and I've had experiences where I thought, well, maybe that's God. Things usually that I can't explain, like a big mystery of the universe kind of thing, you know. And when I was small, I went to Sunday school, so I did have some indoctrination into Anglican, you know, it was a British church, and
Mhm.
we had the fire and brimstone, and we read the Testament and all that stuff. For me, it was like almost like watching a cartoon from the get-go. Like even Santa Claus, I was the kid that was like, nope. You know, but I was also the kid that went, but maybe.
Maybe.
Maybe, you know, in the sense that I don't think that anybody knows, you know, really. Um, because I think I've become incredibly interested my whole life from the time I knew anything about anything else that had to do with religion. I've always been very curious. Krishna and Jehovah and the gods and the goddesses and all of that, you know, from mythology to, you know, books that were written, the Upanishads, and you know, I've read a lot of different descriptions of God and different dogmas, different belief systems, turtles riding through the universe, you know, the breathing of Buddha, and, you know, the whole thing. And I love all of it, you know, and I love Jesus, and I love, you know, I just sort of like, yeah, that's incredible, but I don't see any one as being it. I think it all is it. And more. I think it's a huge, I think it's as mysterious as the universe.
Okay, so the it that you're referring to,
Oh,
is it is it
um,
a
I think saying God, you know,
yeah,
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 God is it.
and and has working on this process that you've been working on, the book, your grief, etc., has it illuminated that territory in some way?
Yes, but you know, it's still a mystery because there's no like uh, logical truth to any of it. But I had experiences where there were a few. One was what I call a not dream. And a not dream is where you do go to sleep at night and then you dream, but you're not really in a dream. You're actually aware that you're in some dream state. And I met with Nanda, and it was like
That's your
I
son.
was yeah, it was Nanda's my son. I
Mhm,
was physically with him
mhm.
in this place, and I was aware, like hyper aware, that I was in my sleeping state, outside of that sleeping state, in this other state with him. um I don't know how to explain that,
Yeah,
you know, but it was like, for me it was like that was as real as anything. But then if you talk to schizophrenics, they say this is as real as what, you know.
sure.
So some may argue that that's just a psychological thing, but I don't think so. I've had experiences like that when I was a kid,
Mhm.
where I saw things move that shouldn't be moving, or doing things that it shouldn't be doing. And I've always been a little susceptible to um, wondering about paranormal activity and all of it, aliens, all, and I just are like, yeah, but or no, but maybe, yeah. So
Yeah.
I like science, I like things to be put, but I don't think science has proved everything. So
No, sure.
yeah.
Well, actually,
Uh,
yes, right. I mean, science never does. There's always the error factor. I mean, the real scientists will readily, let you know that it's always about, disproving the null hypothesis.
right.
And there's always that question. So
Yeah.
we
And
we
so
tend
that's
not to
where
think
my
about
mind
things.
goes, is that there's some possibility here.
Sure.
I just don't understand what it
Yeah.
is, but it's definitely not like, oh, the real world, I think there's more to the real world than we understand. And I think there's different levels. And I love things like metaphysics. And, I took a class with Charles Tart. Do you know who that is?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And he was a remarkable man. And he
Yeah.
had us wear these little rubber bands where we'd pull the rubber band and we'd ask ourselves, are we awake or are we asleep? And I learned how to do lucid dreaming and how to go into dreams and how to control the dreams. And I love all that, and
Yeah.
I think that there's room for understanding the world on a much deeper level when we have an acceptance of there's more to this picture than we understand,
Sure.
rather
Sure.
than it's all has to be proven and so forth. I just think it's like we didn't know about electricity until electricity was proven,
Yeah.
or
Well, I mean, we're launching this massive satellite to see what we've never seen before.
I know. So
So
obviously somebody knows that there's something out there worth
something's
investigating.
there, right?
Yeah.
We've never seen that. So
Right.
so
So,
yeah.
did I veer off topic here?
No, not at all.
Okay.
No, it's there. That's the curiosity invited
Yeah.
part.
So, my son's death reinforced that, because I went to a few places in the state of grief that were what I've read about before. Traveling in a kind of out of body experiences, levitating, and I could say that to somebody, and if someone's a not believer, they're like, really, like, until you prove it, but
Sure.
I experienced it. So I'm like, okay, well,
Right.
uh-huh.
Yeah. And so what do you hope happens with the book?
I would love to get it published. I think,
Yeah.
that be careful what you wish for, right? Um, people scare me, so I just don't want people coming at me, because some of the things that I say in the book, there's a chapter about levitation. There's a chapter about, reaching into the limbic region, not the limbic. What are they called? Well, like the bardo space, between life and death. And
Yeah.
some people might not like that, or think that I'm like some kind of lunatic or something, which is, I guess I'm okay with. I've always been kind of a weirdo, but
that's the courage part, right?
yeah, it is.
It's a new medium.
It is.
Yeah.
It is, because I want to be taken seriously, I think I've written it in a way that it's both poetic, artistic, and also, your wife has looked at it and she said it makes sense,
Do you think people, well, of course they can. I was about to ask, you think people will be helped by it? Some people.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No, I've already helped people with my writing, and the, because I've sent it out into the world before, and parts of it, and people have really, it's opened up their sense of what grief is or what death is about, and also gives people permission to actually, let's talk about it. That's like a really taboo topic, death. It's like people are very uncomfortable. Like, that was another thing that struck me very strongly, is here I was, I lost a son, and no one wanted to come near me. It's like they either didn't know what to do or say, or they wanted me to feel better, so they felt better. They were wondering when I was going to get over it. They didn't understand why I would write a book for 22 years, like she's, lost herself in it. All of that, so I'm a little bit over it, but I'm sure there's some sensitive nerves there that I've yet to discover. And that's the scary part. hopefully
you,
I'm strong enough to go, well, why'd you
well,
read
so
it?
this 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 book, at some point it became a conscious decision to have it be a book.
Yeah,
Right. You didn't start out by, I'm going to write a book about this.
no,
Right. But somewhere in the process, there's a question.
yeah.
I mean, is there a next? I mean, has there been something about writing this book that makes you sort of, hey, I've got some ideas for something else I want to write?
Mm.
Or was it really this singular process that was about, the book was in some ways just sort of epiphenomenal? Really, it just was a
Yeah,
byproduct of this other thing.
there are three things I'd like to write, and when I say that, I'm like, oh God, I don't want to do that again.
I'm running out of 20.
Oh,
If they
thank
take
God.
22 years each,
Yeah,
you're in
I can't
trouble.
take that. Well, I know how to do it much faster now, and I'm retired, so that helps. But yeah, but it's just the sitting your butt in a chair and actually doing it. It's not easy. It's really, really grueling,
It's really
I
grueling.
think.
I wrote one, and I'm still thinking about the second one and wanting to start it, but boy,
Oh, I think you just have to start.
yeah.
So I want to do a poetry book because I have a lot of fragmented poems that I want to work on and actually get them done. It actually is within the same theme. A lot of it arrived through the process of writing this book, and it was way too poetic to put into the book. So I kind of put them aside, and they're gestating.
They're calling you.
And yeah, and then I wouldn't mind doing a workbook, sort of self-help type of book after this one's published that would go along with
Oh, well.
how does one process creatively. Not that they would follow my style, but that there's a way that you can, within my experience, I found that I had some choices, and what do you do with those choices and so forth. So how do you manifest? How do you treat grief? How can you comfort yourself in grief, or accept grief, or allow how horrible it is and go, okay, it's horrible, but this is what is. How do you face in? How do you get the courage to do that? So I would like to do a workbook like that, and then the other thing I'd like to do is a children's book.
About the same topic?
I think so. Yeah. Even though I keep telling myself I'm done with this, I don't want to talk about grief anymore. But I do have some beautiful ideas. There's a chapter in my book that includes a short story about my granddaughter. When she was about 2, she found a dead bird in my yard. And so I left it where it was. And every time she came over, we'd take a look at it, and it slowly decomposed. The feathers fell apart. And we talked about where it went and what it became and so forth. And I thought that could be really a beautiful illustrated book, and I'd be able to do some painting and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you make things every day? Like, I mean, and I have an advantage here, right? I've seen your studio, which is extraordinary.
Yeah.
So do you use all your toys
I do.
on a regular basis? I don't
Yeah.
mean like, really.
Yeah, I think that I tried meditation, and I just have a hard time sitting. So, but I can sit if I have something to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I see art as a meditation, and sometimes I do it just mindlessly. Sometimes, Leah, every day I touch in on art, whether it's I'll go in the garden and look for a leaf that is interesting and take a picture of it. Or the other day I made a pair of earrings, and it's let's see if I can get them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I do a lot of jewelry making. And I do write a lot. Even I work on the book still because I'm still doing some editing process type of stuff, but I'll write a little line or two. So I'm always touching in. Even if it's in the kitchen and I'm like, what if I took the zucchinis that are in the freezer, and like there's always something to make. So making is a creative process, and yeah, I don't follow a recipe. I'm just like,
No, I get it.
let's try this.
Yeah.
Usually works.
Well, so tell me, is this, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You go ahead.
I was going to say, is this a good time to stop? Are you?
It could be, unless you have any other questions.
Well, I have, tons of questions, et cetera, et cetera. We could talk about politics. That's my next book.
Is it?
Well,
Oh,
there's something about it in there. So, yeah.
Okay, that's really good.
In there at the moment, but.
Oh, it's gestating.
It's brewing. So,
yeah.
Anyway.
I'm curious what your other questions are, though, because you said you had a lot of questions. So just rattle.
I when I read through, when you wrote that page, I have paper. I'd especially like to talk about the connection between grief and art. We did that. What art can offer human consciousness, awareness, expression, emotional wellness. And we scratched at the surface of consciousness and awareness. And I was curious about, excuse me, I was curious about whether those distinctions are meaningful to you, consciousness, awareness, those things, and whether they are distinct to you or whether they're words looking at the same sorts of things. I was intrigued by the big me conversation. And then you had on here teaching. And you may have talked about that at the beginning, as like that you're always trying to sort of push people to see things differently. But
I enjoy that. Yeah.
But
I love the idea. I love talking about awareness and consciousness. And what was the other term you used?
You said.
I said.
Consciousness, awareness, expression, and emotional wellness. But I was thinking, well, I mean, and choice fits in there as
choice does fit
as well.
Choice is huge, actually. And we forget when we're like in the, thickness of something that's emotional and overwhelming. And maybe we even get fatigued by that we forget that we have choices. And we can consciously, if we can surface to be conscious and aware of what's going on, have some intent about how we're going to approach a given problem or a given thing that we're up against.
It's interesting. I see that more. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and make choices. And sometimes it's just deciding on something. Like when I did 19 years dead, 19 years alive. That's perfect. Like, I'm just going to celebrate that as the moment of, it was still a process to, and I'm not going to use the term let go, because I actually believe it's more of a embracing the idea of not having to struggle with my son's death. I don't want to struggle with my son's death anymore. I've struggled with it. There's nothing else that needs to be struggled about it. So, but I could see that I was pulled into that constantly, almost like it's like having a mania or something, like a habit.
I see
we train the habit, I don't want to do that. So I made a decision.
Yeah. I see the decision. I mean, to me, that's it's a puzzling territory.
Yeah.
The territory of choice. I mean, I recognize it as, I recognize the experience of feeling like I have choice.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I can make sense of it, right? Thoughts seem to come from nowhere.
Yeah.
Arise from nowhere.
Yeah.
So that's not really a choice, right? And so it's fine. Right. It's hard to find that. Plus, there's that, and I don't want anything that I'm saying to suggest that I don't have the overwhelming feeling that I have it. I can decide to pick up this mouse or not. And
I'm going to clarify.
Yeah.
Let me clarify. So the minute that I made that decision, like I came to a decision of what I wanted. I don't want to struggle. We'll just use that one part because there's many parts to it. Right. I don't want to struggle. around the loss of my son. Just don't want to do that struggle. So then what does that look like to not do that? How does one not do that?
Right.
So then the process starts at the decision-making process, because obviously I'd be sitting like, oh, nope, there comes that thing where I'm going to start feeling like I need to struggle with part of, okay, well, I remind myself, this is happening. I am starting to wheel in my head, how could he possibly have stood on the railroad tracks? I'm going there again. Why would I do? Okay, what I'm going to do instead is think of all the things he did before that, or instead of thinking about why is he standing on the railroad tracks, I'm going to think of, well, he did stand on the railroad tracks, but I don't need to think about that anymore because I already know that. So what I'm going to do now is maybe just write some poetry or go for a walk, and try to just,
Right.
not
Right.
engage that. And that's the practice, right?
Yes.
That's
Right.
the decision making in process. And then there are tools. One can go to a therapist. I've done that before. I'm starting to think about something and it's really upsetting me about my son's death. Call my therapist, make an appointment, go talk to her, process through that and get to the place where I want to go, which is not doing that. And just find all the things. Sometimes it was just, there was this, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, it's called tapping, where there's
Oh.
this tapping that happens on the body. And I really like it because it's like, hello, hello, you're inside, everything's safe. It's not happening now. He's not on the railroad tracks anymore. That's done.
Hmm.
You're okay. And over time, that was okay. I practiced
Mhm.
and it worked.
Exactly. Right.
But
Yes.
that's what worked for me. So it may be a different process. Someone may, like, I think my husband, when in the beginning of this, he'd go in the shop and grind metal and cut metal and make stuff. That's what worked for him. He had to invent and go into his inventive mind to get away from reeling through that. I had a friend who was a doctor and his son had committed suicide and he found him. It was really devastating. And I said, what do you do? And he goes, well, I train myself not to think about it because you wrap your myelin sheaths. Every time you think of that, it becomes a stronger and stronger memory, the bad memory that you make. So try to wrap a myelin sheath around, something that you appreciate about your kid, So
Yeah.
those are creative problem solving things that I see as living an art life, like finding some way to channel your humanness to a more, not like necessarily positive, but something that feels right for you,
Mhm.
other than the thing that not to avoid. I guess the problem with what I'm saying is that in the early process of grief, I had to go there and I would avoid it. And I had to go there until I didn't need to go there anymore because I'd been there a lot.
Right.
So I think in order to make a decision about not going there, you better have been there and done the work. Otherwise, it's going to pop up and it's going to rattle around and do some destructive damage when you're trying to avoid something. So I'm not talking about avoidance. I'm talking about, I've done the work. I know what's happened. I don't need to struggle around it anymore. What I need to do is find the light of life in myself and the world so that I can live, not happy, who lives happy, but I can live and be, sustain
Happiness
some
are those
sense of,
moments between things.
if I get that, great. So, but that some well-being, and well-being fluctuates. It's manageable, it's not having to be dragged into a horrible obsessive loop around something that you've already struggled with. And you're just like draining all your energy into a place that doesn't even really exist necessarily.
Right. Except in you.
Right. So, he stood on the tracks once.
Yes.
And I talk about that too in a piece that I wrote about this map that I had. And It was a choreography that can only be done once.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have to do that choreography over and over again. I could think about it if I want to, but I don't have to. So how do I get away from it? Because it is a very strong memory. I can choose to do something else. And that, again, that's a process.
Mm-hmm.
Now I can do it because I've been practicing. I can do it pretty readily. Something comes up and I go, oh, no, been there. I'm like, flip the switch. I can turn it off. And it's not an avoidance. It's just I don't need to, I've done that. I've already done it. Yeah. No guilt, no shame,
Mm-hmm.
no pain, no regret. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that took a long time.
I was about to say that took a long time.
Mhm.
And it sounds like
But it's not forever. That's the thing, because I was told
right.
that grief lasts forever. And no.
It took a long time, but it also sounds like it's resulted in you'll excuse the expression, a product that is rich and
Mhm.
textured and
Yeah.
and likely very helpful for people who, for whatever reason, are experiencing grief.
And for me too, it's a placeholder. I took it from my body, expressed it into the product is fine, into the product,
Right.
the object, the art object,
Yeah.
and I can look at it, I can share it, but I don't have to hold it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You don't have to hold it in
I
there.
don't have to hold it.
Yeah.
I like place markers a lot, and I see art as place markers.
Yeah.
You take this particular thing and put it here out of my body so I don't have to hold it. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop.
Yeah.
And I so appreciate you giving us the time, giving me the time,
Oh.
and being willing to talk about both and share some of the tender images, et cetera, of that.
Absolutely.
So thank you.